This screencast, we're going to be addressing the gay rights presentations. You can find the topics in this section by opening up this file. So the expectation is you have some understanding of these terms, events, people, treat them like definitions. There's a possibility you will also be asked to complete this question sheet right here, or this sheet where you put the topic, write a brief summary, and then you make a determination about whether or not the topic is a biological or social explanation. So I'm going to go through these topics here, just try to give you a brief summary on each one. And this is broken down with certain sections like 1900s, 1940s, 50s, 70s. So the first thing we want to address is the Buggery Laws. Buggery Laws, these were European laws that targeted not homosexuals, but what was labeled as acts against nature. This could also be a reference to Sodom and Gomorrah, which is why sodomy laws exist in the United States and were a issue that the gay rights movement needed to address all the way up until the 2000s. So Buggery Law simply is a law that targeted homosexuals through the coded language of unnatural acts, sexual acts. Biological and social explanation, you need to know the difference between the two. Everything that we're looking at, these theorists, these ideas, these arguments that are made by people, they're always trying to make a case for homosexuality, bisexuality, anything that fits under the LGBTQ umbrella. They're trying to make a case for it being a biological, a nature argument, or is it something that somebody is taught, a behavior. Homosexuality defined by society. This is simply about the role society plays in helping to shape. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a minute. So the first thing we're going to address here is the term homosexuality. And in the 1800s, whether we're looking at Havelock Ellis, Karl Ulrich, these individuals in the 1800s were the first to start to use the term homosexual. But that will not gain popularity until the early 1900s. But in the 1800s, the first recorded use is this individual right here, and he was challenging a sodomy law in Prussia. He also worked with Karl Havelock Ellis as well as Karl Ulrich, and Havelock Ellis in 1901 would use that same term. We talked extensively about Karl Ulrich. Karl Ulrich, the individual who's trying to come up with a biological explanation. And his biological explanation is simply that there are three sexes. You have a male, you have a female, and then you have what eventually will become his inversion theory. That would be the third sex. So if it's biological, there's less of a chance for government to legislate. And this slide here simply looks at some of his work. And with his work, he comes up with various terms to describe certain behaviors. And if you looked up these behavior or these groups, they would mention all types of, groups that currently fit under the LGBTQ umbrella. So here he is looking at specific behaviors and trying to explain how those behaviors are not found among male and females, which is what justifies, in his view, the identification of a third sex. Homosexuality and inverts. Inversion stems from Karl Ulrich's work, and inversion is simply this idea to explain behavior by making the case that the internal female in this physical male is what's causing this male to engage in woman-like behavior. So any overt expression of what a female is supposed to act like, that is an invert. So if we take this male here, and let's just say this male is putting on a dress, according to the rules of society, a male will not put on a dress, but an inverted male would, simply because of the female, the internal female, the psyche. of that male being more female-like, and any outward expression is an outward expression of the internal female. That's inversion theory. Let's look at some of the social explanation and social role. So for this slide, we're looking at Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, I'll just say, historically goes down in history as being a man's man. I know that's going to sound really odd, and some people might, have a problem with that. But this is an individual that's into hunting. He's in the military, storming up San Juan Hill. So for the early 1900s, this guy is viewed as a masculine man. And in some of his speeches, he was not afraid to use this term mollycoddle. And mollycoddle suggests a female-like behavior. A feminine man could possibly be the result of spending too much time with mom. So if we take dad in the nuclear family and mom, and now they have a child, and that child is demonstrating female-like behaviors, that would be a result of mom mollycoddling the boy. He's spending too much time with the male as opposed to the dad, or with the female as opposed to the dad, and that is why this male is now demonstrating female-like behaviors. So they're trying to explain the mollycoddle is trying to explain homosexuality through a social lens, that you can be trained to have those female-like behaviors, and that's the term mollycoddle. And since Roosevelt's using that term, that is going to shape some of the understanding of how male and female are supposed to act under gender social constructs. So what you want to do with this sheet here is just, I've already addressed these items, so you want to have some understanding. Just treat them as definitions as we move on to some of the other individuals here. So here we're looking at Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was a leftist, anti-war advocate, labor advocate, and she is the one of the first to start advocating for lesbian women. You notice how there's also a reference to Hirschfeld, and we'll be talking about Magnus Herschel in a minute. And Emma Goldman in the early 1900s in the United States, one of the women like Mary Aquia was advocating for um, gay rights. Walt Whitman. There's a debate about Walt Whitman, whether or not in his writing this individual was struggling. And if you look up his name and you in a search engine with like gay rights, you probably will come up with people trying to analyze his work. In the section here, uh, I know it is in me. I do not know it. It is without name. It is a word unsaid. So gay rights advocates will argue that this individual was struggling with sexual inversion, which we addressed before through the work of Carl Ulrich. So it's simply just looking at this individual's writing and making a determination about whether this individual was closeted through his work. Boston marriage, I just did a quick search for this. Boston marriage, although there is a history attached to it, this was slang that originated in Boston, and it was designed to explain why two women would want to be in some sort of relationship, and it could be as simple as just living together. So these two women here, if they're not willing to get married and join a husband in the establishing of a nuclear family, and for like, why would they not want to be subjected to that system of patriarchy? If this woman is going to live with this woman, how would we explain it? Well, it would be explained through just the Boston marriage. And that's the significance of that. So it was a way to identify a married, a two women. That's which is not traditional for that particular point. They're not able to get married. That would not be allowed either. So you have to come up with something, some sort of term and label for that particular behavior. We're now going to transition to Magnus Herschel. Magnus Herschel is from Germany, and he is a sex theorist, and he is trying to engage in research in in Germany since the 1800s, there was a law called Paragraph 175, and 175 targeted homosexual behavior. The Nazis come to power in 1933, and then they come up with an extension to 175, 175A, which is outlined here. And looking at the law, a male who with force or with threat of imminent danger to life and limb compels another male. So this is significant because in this scenario, if we have two males and they are going to engage in some sort of act, the question here is whether or not this individual is being forced. So it goes right back to the nature-nurture argument, the social explanation for homosexuality. The question here would be, if this individual is going to force this individual, put a gun on him, does that necessarily make this individual an invert or a homosexual? Or is he only engaging in that behavior as a result of the coercion, the force? And that seems to be very typical because going back with the Buggery Laws throughout European history, the Buggery Laws would simply just punish. Usually the punishment's going to be death. So it was very likely in a situation where two men were found violating a Buggery Law that one would just say, this individual forced me. Like, if you're going to violate the Buggery Law, the punishment is death. So what would you rather have? Both of these individuals found guilty and sentenced to death? Or in this case, this guy is saying, you know what, he forced me, which then means this guy is going to get the punishment of death. This individual will wind up walking away or with a reduced punishment. So when we're looking at laws targeting homosexual behavior, they always seem to be concerned about the age. And that is also then making a judgment about whether or not people are born gay or society, or they could be made gay. But the significance between Magnus Herschel and Henry Gerber is going to create one of the first gay rights organizations in the United States, the Society for Human Rights. So the argument is that when the Nazis cracked down on Magnus Herschel, many of his followers, one in particular, Henry Gerber, left Germany and fled to the United States and created one of the first gay rights organizations, the Society for Human Rights. At this point, we should be right here at number 7, and you might be asked to answer this question sheet. Let's move on into the 1940s and 1950s. So the question here I put in yellow is homosexuals as sexual deviants. This section, various researchers argue that Judeo-Christian heritage primarily taught human sexuality from a negative, hostile perspective as EOE. So this section here that's underlined or encircled, a negative and hostile perspective. In the 1950s, we're about to get into the conversation about sex education. So prior to the 1950s, if there's a negative and hostile perspective about sexuality, how then is that going to change the way people think about sex? So we're looking at the answer to the question, is sex for reproduction or is it for enjoyment? Which is an important question because if we're looking at gay men or women, if either of those two couples are going to engage in a sexual act, the end result is never going to be reproduction. So then that looks at the question and it answers it by saying, well, the reason why the individuals are engaging in a sexual act is for enjoyment. And so historically, especially in the United States, they're looking at the end goal for sex to be about reproduction, not about enjoyment, which is why they're teaching sexuality from a negative and hostile perspective. It's looking at the answer to that particular question. So we're looking at the 1950s. In this particular slide, we see the boy and just some devices here, and the devices could be used to prevent the boy uh, from trying to ask questions about what's going on with his male reproductive sexual organ. So these devices, historically, for example, this could be used to prevent the boy from touching himself, or this particular item here. So goal or the end result by utilizing any of these devices could be that this individual is going to develop a negative perception about sexuality. Why does that matter? Because you're linking the male reproductive organ. If there's any sort of touching down there that is excessive, that could be labeled as deviant behavior. What is the end goal for sexual acts? We already addressed that. And that is going to play a role in how, in the 1940s and 1950s, homosexuality is viewed, because the behavior is going to be viewed as deviant, because the end goal is not going to be about reproduction. And we already know how certain individuals wanted to try to prevent their young from developing any sort of positive view on sexuality. Things get so bad that if you looked up the Dachau for queers, you would come across a Tescadero State Hospital, which was in the United States. And this was a place where individuals who were accused of rape or accused of excessive masturbation or homosexuality or bestiality, these individuals were locked into this particular facility where experiments were performed on them. So the whole point with these slides is just trying to get you to think about, in 1950s, 1940s, what was the view on sexuality? What were some of the issues? They're sexual deviant. We're really concerned about the end goal for sex, whether it's for reproduction or enjoyment, and that there can be a negative stigma attached to any sort of behavior that is of a sexual nature that is not for reproduction. That's significant to understand uh, the role in the military. If they're sexual deviants, how can they perform their job? At the end of World War II, any soldier found violating any of the sexual deviancy or outed as a homosexual can be discharged from the military through a blue discharge. This simply means that you would be kicked out of the military and given a dishonorable discharge. So the first uh, gay rights groups that are going to emerge in the United States, I know we already talked about Henry Gerber, some of the early ones, are also going to be groups like the Knights of the Clock and the Veterans Benevolent Association of New York. These were veteran groups. And eventually, you're going to see the development of the Mattachine Society. And the Mattachine Society is a key gay rights organization during the Homophile Movement. The Homophile Movement was specific to the 1950s gay rights organizations, and one of its founders was a man by the name of Harry Hay. So the goal for Harry Hay was to create numerous gay rights organizations throughout his Mattachine Society. So the Mattachine Society is the organization, but you could have a Mattachine Society chapter in New York, you could have it in California, you could have it in New Jersey, wherever it is that you wanted to have this particular organization. He was totally okay with expanding his organization. The Mattachine Society would later split, and you would have some of the members establish a magazine called One. In the United States, during the Cold War, they passed Executive Order 10450. And 10450 is a Cold War piece of legislation or executive order, and it looks at sexual perversion. They're not using the term homosexuality, and so they're trying to outlaw homosexuals from government positions. And the fear is going to be the Cold War. If we have a Russian spy here and an American homosexual federal employee, this individual could possibly blackmail that individual. So let's just say this guy is working on making nuclear bombs and he has sensitive information. The Russian spy can approach him and say, listen, if you don't give us access to the nuclear bomb, we are going to out you as a homosexual. And because of Executive Order 10450, this guy would lose his position. And so the first issue that is going to be on the Mattachine Society agenda is to get rid of things like the blue discharge as well as Executive Order 10450, even though the Crittenden report established that the homosexuals played no, that there was no negative outcome of having homosexuals in the military. One of the guys Harry Hay would inspire would be Frank Kameny, who would establish a DC chapter of the Mattachine Society. And this individual would work to lobby the government and try to find cases to take them to the Supreme Court. But he always advocated for his view that gay is good. And he wanted to make sure that when you're protesting for gay rights, that you presented yourself in a way that was acceptable according to the rules of society. So here we see Frank Kameny in a suit, and that is going to be an issue that is going to be problematic for him later. Here we see some information about Frank Kameny. And again, the role of Frank Kameny, he's a Mattachine Society member, and he's going to be the one individual that's trying to pressure the government to make change, and he would be influential in other groups as well. So we are probably around here, around 11 and 12, and that's the end of part 1.